community was illuminated by electricity generated by an atomic reactor.
But less than 2 years after that dramatic send-off, something went wrong. Some of the fuel rods partially melted. Various reasons, including buildups of radioactivity in the building above the reactor. That's what led to the final shutdown 13 days after the first signs of trouble.
Appalled at the sort of the cavalier attitude that they demonstrated.
The official news release claimed there was no indication of unsafe reactor conditions, and newspapers treated the matter routinely. Local public safety officials weren't told much either.
That would be unheard of in today's safety atmosphere. Sort of a damn the torpedoes full speed ahead attitude, which is fine if you're fighting a war, I guess, but it's certainly not a way to run a reactor. A slipshod operation, I guess, is the way I would describe it.
This film is a combination of actual and reenacted scenes. It is presented for the purpose of studying and improving the methods and techniques of handling nuclear emergencies.
Today, if you were to take a trip in almost any direction across our great country, you might suddenly come upon a sign such as this: Atomic City. This means the location nearby of one of our atomic energy plants, a potent reminder that we now live in the atomic age. What are such communities like? Atomic cities, cities near atomic plants, are pleasant places of comfortable and well-built family homes. There are modern schools and churches, libraries, hospitals, post offices. With the ever-increasing use of nuclear energy, more towns may eventually become atomic cities, cities near safe and efficient atomic plants.
The Susanna reactor started producing power early in November, and our cameras were focused on the town at 7:30 p.m., November 12, 1957. Enrico Fermi once looked at a reactor and said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if it could cure the common cold?" Here at Moore Park, a chain reaction that started with him washed the dishes and lit a book for a small boy to read.
There was a nuclear accident in the mountains west of Chatsworth. It happened 20 years ago. There was no large-scale public exposure to radiation, but the public has never been given details till now. And tonight, for the first time, Warren's going to tell us the story and show us the film on this. Warren?
Thank you, John. Unit 4 has been able to dig up government films and documents that show what happened. Something went wrong. Some of the fuel rods partially melted. The damage turned out to be very extensive. 13 of 43 fuel rods partially melted. 81 pieces of uranium fuel scattered around on the bottom of the core. The SRE was cooled not with water, as most reactors now are, but with sodium, a liquid metal. This animation, on a government film never shown in public before, shows the sodium filling up the reactor, going up between the radioactive fuel rods. When the fuel rods partially melted in 1959, the sodium absorbed the most dangerous of the materials produced by the accident, so they stayed in the reactor. But the operators did not know what had happened till sometime after the accident occurred. The official reports almost sigh with relief. But it could have turned out differently.
Luckily, the fission product release, that is, the release of radioactive materials, was contained within the sodium. But there was always a chance that if fuel melting had proceeded unchecked, that it would have been released into the surrounding area, especially iodine and strontium. The iodine and strontium are very dangerous because the iodine goes to the thyroid glands of young children, causing thyroid cancer, and the strontium goes to the bones of growing children, causing leukemia.
Certainly people were following that reactor all the time. It did not appear to be a hazard to the public or to our employees, and in retrospect it wasn't a hazard to our employees or public. And we put the plant back on the line.
In 1989, the Daily News reported on a secret study conducted by the Department of Energy revealing widespread chemical and radioactive contamination at the site, which had contaminated the mountain.
Boeing has been ordered by the state to clean up the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, and the company says they have made tremendous progress, but Consumer Watchdog claims instead they've used lobbyists to sidestep the project. Activist Dan Hirsch.
Boeing concluded that it's cheaper to hire some well-connected hired guns to get out of their obligations than it is to comply with them.
In a statement, Boeing denies all of the charges, but neighbor Bonnie Klee, who is diagnosed with bladder cancer after working at the test site, says she's seen cancer in every house on her block.
I don't want the chemicals and the radiological contamination left there. I don't want another generation exposed to what we've been exposed to.
Megan Goldsby, KNX 1070 News Radio.
My name's Holly Huff. I was diagnosed with CLL, which is chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
Dawn Kowalski, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer.
Barbara Johnson, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer.
I'm Marie Mason. I was diagnosed with a thyroid condition.
I had bladder cancer. My son, who lives in Moorpark, also had bladder cancer.
My daughter had half her thyroid removed when she was 21. To this date, I've had removed about 130 basal cell carcinomas from my face and my body. The worst affected has been my right eye, which is, I've had at least 25 tumors around my eye.
Was this a minor release? Was it a major release? Was this sort of a oh my god release? How severe was this?
Well, the major release could be oh my god, what do we with all those men that disturbed them so bad they had tears in their eyes about because they weren't able to tell their just because of the release and where it went. Them decided they couldn't even tell their own wives or families about it. So it was very, very big. It was. That's why they call it the worst nuclear accident in history of the United States. So this is the part I want to let everybody know about. There's stories about they had the tanks to take and release the gases into, but what happened is during that day when they was trying to shut the reactor down, those storage tanks were gotten filled up, was trying to stop the reactor. And there they were. They had the tanks full. Everything was, they couldn't do anything. What do we do now? If we don't shut something down, it's going to blow up. And so what they had to do, they had to release the nuclear radiation straight out of the reactor, out in the atmosphere. This has not been talked about, but I was there and I know it happened. It went out over the San Fernando Valley, went over the eastern end of Simi Valley.
They were having trouble with the reactivity in the core, and they decided to pump the radioactive gases out of the core in order to try to see if they could solve the problem. It's just extraordinary. They had a power excursion, which means the power goes on excursion, on a trip. It increases exponentially in fractions of a second, and they could barely shut the reactor down, but after an hour and a half of not being able to figure out what caused it, they started it up again and ran for another 2 weeks. In the presence of very high radiation reading.
The whole building at one time got contaminated from breaking a fuel rod element off in the reactor and contaminated the whole complete building. We couldn't even get around the building for about almost 2 miles around the building.
Again, no containment structure. Radioactive material was put into these tanks and then intentionally released into the atmosphere for weeks.
You have to look back at the population density of the Santa Susana in that period. You were up there the other day, but at that time it was a dirt road to Santa Susana. There was no population in the area.
And the men asked him, can we tell our families about it? Can we tell them? It went right over our own homes. We live in Chatsworth, Canoga Park, all those areas. Can we let our wives know what had happened? They come back to him and says, no, you cannot. No, I don't want anybody saying a word about it. We'll report what happened to the public in our own due time. And then he turned around and come over to me where I'm standing there taping up the door and all that, and he got right up next to me like a sergeant in the military right in my face and says, you will not say a word about what happened here today. And he really got stern about it, scared me half to death. in the fashion you had done that. So here I am talking to you right now. I was not supposed to say a word. And this is something I have to say to all of you. It was something very important. Just give me a second. Important to me to be able to let you know what actually happened. It's been with me 55 years. I've known this, but this is my first opportunity.
Not that much of a hazard to even our local people, as evidenced by the short period of time it took us to clean up the facility and recover it.
What fancy equipment were you provided to get the radioactivity off of these surfaces?
High-tech equipment, which was Bactine, which we've probably all seen in the drugstore. It's a antiseptic solution, and we use feminine napkins, Kotex, because they are highly absorbent of whatever's on the floors and walls. So that's how.
The radioactive contamination on the walls and floors was cleaned up using Kotex?
Kotex and Bactine, yes.
You told me once that as dangerous as the reactors were, there were more dangerous facilities on the property. What in particular?
Well, we had several. The one that comes to mind to me is the hot cell, which makes this, it's even, I think, worse in many instances, because at the hot cell, they dissected fuel elements, irradiated fuel elements there. And so when you're doing that, that's pretty risky business.
Absolutely immense amounts of radioactivity were brought into the hot lab. This was irradiated nuclear fuel from large reactors around the country.
To draw you a quick picture of it, it's obviously a building, but with all these individual cells inside, and there was approximately 8 or 10 of them, and they have these what they call manipulators. They're like slaves, and the walls separating the workers and the fuel elements where the actual work went on are about 8 foot thick. And so you're looking through a leaded glass window in at this element that's probably reading somewhere in the area of 2,000 or 3,000 R per hour, which is death if you were to be exposed to it directly. So they're decladding these fuel elements, and that's creating dust and dirt and so on. Well, occasionally they would have a fire or a flood, and what do the workers do? I mean, you run. You absolutely run when the fire alarm goes off, or any other radiation alarm. You run, because it may mean your life.
If there were a fire involving that radioactive material, the fire is a driving force that releases the radioactive material into the environment. So whichever way the wind blew, it would take it to populated areas.
But there is another problem facing the people of our atomic city, a problem which is calling for the best efforts of our scientists. That is the matter of waste disposal. One of the foremost considerations of the Atomic Energy Commission is the safety of these people who work and live in cities near atomic plants. Therefore, waste material, which might be potentially dangerous, must be removed and stored safely. This work is vitally important.
And did you have some role or some recollection that you wanted to pass on regarding the sodium burn pit?
Oh yes, well,
tell people what that was first.
Okay, it was a pit where like a small lake, and they took the various chemicals, and especially sodium and Nyack. Nyack and sodium are both used primarily for the coolants in the primary cooling system of reactors. It disperses the heat. Well, they would take this used Nyack after it was removed from the reactor out, put it in drums, 55-gallon drums, take it to the sodium burn pit, put it in a small rowboat, one drum at a time, and row it out to the center of the lake, push the drum in the water, and then row back and get behind the coverage of a blockhouse. And they would shoot the drum with a 30-06 rifle, therefore allowing the water to seep into the drum. And when water comes in contact with Nyack or sodium, it's a very serious explosion. And this is the way that they burned off this waste material, as well as other chemicals and so on.
It was quite unusual. Normally, you dispose of radioactive materials in specially designed and licensed radioactive waste facilities. So open air burning was not supposed to occur for anything radioactive, but they did it anyway.
So this burning was in the open air overlooking Simi Valley.
Absolutely. The smoke would travel all over the complex up there, including Rocketdyne and the Atomics International Complex, and would travel into Simi Valley as well as the San Fernando Valley.
And radioactive and chemical waste really weren't supposed to be burned there, just clean sodium, but they ended up having a fair amount of radioactivity and chemicals, and we've got now contamination both in the groundwater beneath that site, and some of it migrated off-site to what was then the Brandeis Camp Institute.
Yes, that is true. There was two burn pits that I was familiar with. One was on the Rocketdyne side, and there's another one on the nuke side, which was Atomics International. And my understanding, there was may have been a couple of others, but those are the two that I was familiar with.
Went on for decades, and it was conducted in part because a famous memorandum by the company official that it was costly and took a lot of time to get the appropriate permits and ship the material off for appropriate disposal, so it would be easier to burn it in these open pits.
Ever stop to think that the breeze which rustles the flowers and trees and carries the scent of spring, the warmth of summer, and the spice of winter could be radioactive?
Your lung tissue is very sensitive to radiation. The inhalation dose is 10 times its skin dose. And so noble gases are very penetrating. They can go right through a gas mask. They can go through activated charcoal. They will bathe the lungs with beta radiation and gamma radiation and can cause cancer in the lung tissue.
Suppose you are a worker in an atomic energy plant located near one of these atomic cities. This is you coming home to your family. Aside from the usual safety precautions, what steps are taken to protect you at work? Matter of fact, there are many, so many, that working in these plants is among the safest occupations in the world.
My name is Ralph Powell. I was a sergeant in security at Atomics International from 1962 to 1968. And I'm wondering, my question is, what's the chances of tracking in radiation to the family? I lost my only son from leukemia. 1967, my wife had breast cancer.
Did you work at Santa Sue?
Yes, I did.
Your chances were very good because all you were probably only wearing is a film badge, and I don't think you probably were required to monitor your clothing or yourself when you went home. And we had a lot of airborne, huge amounts of airborne activity being released from what we have about 8 running reactors up there at any given time. And you could run across it and not even know it. It could be airborne, or you could maybe touch something and still not realize it. And I would think that, like where John worked, I mean, the activity was so high on the floors and the walls and in the parking lots and cars. So I would think that you're right on the money with that.
With the SRE reactor, just my experience, 24/7 radiation was coming out of that reactor, going all over the hill. It could be the ones in Rocketdyne, it could be anywhere on the hill. You was being exposed every day you was there. Because with the SRE reactor, with the type of works going on, and no containment building to hold it in, you went home with it on you. So that's what my wife worries about too.
So far we have 3,700 claims from workers. I get phone calls every day from surviving family members and community members who have cancer. When I was first diagnosed in 1995, I did a survey in my neighborhood, since our houses were built in 1959, the same year as the partial meltdown, and I found that there were at least 2 cancers in every house. And I took a notepad and I went to every neighborhood around, and it was the same way. And all the houses that were old like mine, cancers. 3 studies showed bladder cancer in my census tract, and the sites closest to the hill are 50 to 55% higher. We have melanoma that's 89% above what it should be, and that's continuing today. The contamination is running off-site.
In the late 90s, DOE funded an independent study. UCLA did the work, and they found higher death rates from blood, lymph cancers, and several other cancers. I was diagnosed in 1995 with a solid tumor, and my doctors asked me where I worked, and I said I worked at Atomics International, and they said they were treating a lot of employees, and they said don't forget brain cancer. They had a whole ward over at the hospital with brain cancer. They didn't protect the workers, they didn't tell them what they were doing, they didn't warn them. And then when the workers got cancer and filed a lawsuit, the federal government fought them in court. So far, the workers have been compensated $154 million for their cancers. And I'm still working on it.
Yes, our atomic city is exactly like any other, and special and detailed precautions are taken to keep these expanding communities that way. This golf course, for example, similar to thousands just like it all over the country, with well-tended greens and tricky traps. But if this player should send a long drive out of bounds, she might discover this man. He is protecting the people who live near an atomic installation by taking vegetation samples to test for the presence of radioactive material.
William Preston Bowling, Aerospace Contamination Museum of Education. My question is for Robert Dodge. During the couple of weeks of this meltdown, they released radioactive gases into the air. And anyone who knows the history of Simi valleys and the San Fernando valleys, we had milk and beef and oranges. How does that affect those?
Sure. Well, the thing about the radioactive isotopes is they're taken up by all living things as though they were essential life-giving compounds. The strontium-90 the body looks at as as calcium. Cesium looks like potassium to the body. Potassium is universally taken through all parts of the body, and again, they have half-lives of 30 years, but in medical terms, it takes 20 to 30 half-lives to make them inert. So that's 600 years they remain effective. Plutonium-239 is the most toxic substance we know on the planet, with a half-life of 24,000 years, requiring 500,000 years to render it, medically inert. So these are incredibly toxic things. That's wherein we emphasize there is no safe level. You can take it in now, but it just sits there and emits and emits and emits and emits. Okay, and if you're lucky and you don't get it within years or decades, type of thing, that's great. But I mean, you never know. You're never outside that risk. Another study was performed of the off-site population for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and they found that the incidence rate was more than 60% greater among residents living within a 2-mile radius of the Santa Susana field, more than among residents living more than 5 miles away. And these were for the following types of cancers. Cancers of the thyroid, upper aerodigestive, which is the mouth, nasal cavities, pharynx, larynx, and esophagus, the bladder and blood and lymph areas, and blood tissues and chemistries like leukemias, lymphomas, and multiple myelomas. These are all areas where these radioisotopes settle. They're like in the bladder and the colon, etc., and where they continue to have their ongoing effects. 216 times in recent years, 216 times, toxic materials have migrated off-site, okay, when they were picked up by rainwater and transported into contaminated levels at areas in excess of recognized pollution limits. That is to say, levels deemed by regulators to be safe for public or the environment. Contaminated groundwater has also migrated off-site. The facility is on the hills above, and the contamination flows down to the city below. It is therefore extremely important from a health standpoint that all contamination that can be found is cleaned up so as to protect people and the environment from this radioactive and toxic pollution.
Tonight, a new report is out about a nuclear accident here in the Southland almost 50 years ago. At the time, Rocketdyne Lab near Simi Valley. It happened there, and it says the accident did have long-lasting health effects. Channel 4's Patrick Healy live in Simi Valley right now with more on this story. Patrick.
Colleen, over the years, suspicions of contamination released from the lab have
in effect only been encouraged by the secrecy that long shrouded the nuclear and rocket testing.
Studies now have demonstrated that a large amount of radioactivity apparently was released from that accident in 1959, and that in the Los Angeles region at large, several hundred cancers are likely to result in.
Many at this meeting are convinced illnesses in their family were caused by exposure from the Santa Susana lab.
Well, we were horrified because we were raising our children here. This is like paradise. I mean, we all have creeks running through our yard. Our children played in the creeks when they were little.
Soon after, a representative from Rocketdyne attended their homeowners association meeting.
Oh, there was nothing to worry about. You know, you'd get more radiation if you flew to Denver. We were told you'd get more radiation sleeping next to your husband.
Yeah. Or eating a banana.
By this time, Rocketdyne ownership had changed hands, and the corporate red tape got worse.
The Goliath just kept getting bigger because we started out with Rockwell owning it, and they were big enough, but then you got Boeing. They're one of the biggest corporations in the world.
For the next 20 years, there was constant struggle because the people who had run both the nuclear facility and the rocket testing were very resistant to take responsibility for the contamination that they had created. They just didn't want to have to clean it up. And the longer they delayed, the more stuff migrated off-site, because every time it rained, the rain carried some of that toxic contamination that's in the soil off-site. The groundwater migrated off-site, and the contamination in the soil when the wind blew would also be resuspended and move off-site. And years went by with people who are in this room giving up a huge amount of their life, seeing their children grow up, and now their grandchildren they thought would finally be protected. About 30 of you went up to Sacramento to meet with the then Secretary of Cal EPA, Linda Adams, who had been convinced by her staff that things were okay and that any real attempt to clean things up the way we wanted to wasn't practical. And one member of that citizens delegation was a mother whose child had been diagnosed with retinoblastoma. It's a horrible cancer of the eye that appears in young children a few months after birth. The child has to have the eye surgically removed, or both eyes occasionally, and then undergo chemo. And there had been a cluster, 8 or 9 kids in a tiny area of about 30,000 people. This normally occurs in 1 in a million births. Or 1 in a million people, I don't remember which way, but anyway, a huge number of retinoblastomas. And we saw on Secretary Adams' face something change. A senior bureaucrat, a senior official, whose heart melted, and who then turned to her staff person and began to understand that what she had been told wasn't true. That the operator of the facility, which is Boeing, has very powerful lobbyists, had been able to, through her staff, which was fairly close to Boeing, get her to do something that she later regretted. So she reversed course and committed to trying to get this site cleaned up. During the time that she was secretary, then Senator Sheila Kuehl and then Assembly Member Julia Brownlee, with a large number of others, quite bipartisan in fact, managed to get legislation through that was signed by the governor, SB 990, that required the cleanup of the site to the most protective standards, which are the rural residential standards.
The Department of Energy, NASA, and Boeing currently are responsible for the cleanup. Last December, the DOE and NASA agreed to clean up their portions to the highest of standards. But Boeing has not. It's suing the state of California because it feels the cleanup standards are unconstitutional.
Boeing spokesperson Blake Jameson told us decades of extensive sampling have shown there is no evidence of contamination that has adversely affected the surrounding community.
Government promised to clean it up, and now politics looks like it may never get cleaned up and these people may remain at risk.
Tonight in Simi Valley, many neighbors agree fines and cleanup efforts have been inadequate.
What assurances can we give them that if they purchase this land to build their homes on, or to keep this land for gardening or what have you, that it's safe?
If you want to feel more protected, you need to get the site cleaned up so there's no longer a source That's the rest of it. There's not much we can do. But to get rid of that source, that's the key thing that we have to do. The contamination on the hill that wants to go off the hill.
On your travels across the continent, you may pass through several atomic cities. Some are large, some are small. But they are all good cities to live in which to raise your family, make friends, and enjoy a full life. Atomic cities, cities near atomic laboratories, will become more numerous as nuclear energy work expands, as we continue to travel into the atomic age. So continue your journey across the country. Who knows? Possibly your own community may one day become an atomic city through the magic of the atom.
Damn the torpedoes full speed ahead attitude, which is fine if you're fighting a war, I guess, but it's certainly not a way to run a reactor. A slipshod operation, I guess, is the way I would describe it.
This film is a combination of actual and reenacted scenes. It is presented for the purpose of studying and improving the methods and techniques of handling nuclear emergencies. Today, if you were to take a trip in almost any direction across our great country, you might suddenly come upon a sign such as this: Atomic City. This means the location nearby of one of our atomic energy plants, a potent reminder that we now live in the atomic age. What are such communities like? Atomic cities, cities near atomic plants, are pleasant places of comfortable and well-built family homes.
Now, and tonight, for the first time, Warren's going to tell us the story and show us the film on this. Warren?
Thank you, John. Unit 4 has been able to dig up government films and documents that show what happened. Something went wrong. Some of the fuel rods partially melted. The damage turned out to be very extensive. 13 of 43 fuel rods partially melted. 81 pieces of uranium fuel scattered around on the bottom of the core. The SRE was cooled not with water, as most reactors now are, but with sodium, a liquid metal. This animation, on a government film never shown in public before, shows the sodium filling up the reactor, going up between the radioactive fuel rods. When the fuel rods partially melted in 1959, the sodium absorbed the most dangerous of the materials produced by the accident, so they stayed in the reactor. But the operators did not know what had happened till sometime after the accident occurred. The official reports almost sigh with relief. But it could have turned out differently.
Luckily, the fission product release, that is, the release of radioactive material,
For the first time in the United States, an entire community was illuminated by electricity generated by an atomic reactor.
But less than 2 years after that dramatic send-off, something went wrong. Some of the fuel rods partially melted. Various reasons, including buildups of radioactivity in the building above the reactor. That's what led to the final shutdown 13 days after the first signs of trouble.
Appalled at the sort of the cavalier attitude that they demonstrated.
The official news release claimed there was no indication of unsafe reactor conditions, and newspapers treated the matter routinely. Local public safety officials weren't told much either.
That would be unheard of in today's safety atmosphere. Sort of a...
There are modern schools and churches, libraries, hospitals, post offices. With the ever-increasing use of nuclear energy, more towns may eventually become atomic cities, cities near safe and efficient atomic plants.
The Susanna reactor started producing power early in November, and our cameras were focused on the town at 7:30 p.m., November 12, 1957. Enrico Fermi once looked at a reactor and said, Wouldn't it be wonderful if it could cure the common cold? Here at Moore Park, a chain reaction that started with him, washed the dishes, and lit a book for a small boy to read.
There was a nuclear accident in the mountains west of Chatsworth. It happened 20 years ago. There was no large-scale public exposure to radiation, but the public has never been given details till now.
Materials was contained within the sodium, but there was always a chance that if fuel melting had proceeded unchecked, that it would have been released into the surrounding area, especially iodine and strontium. The iodine and strontium are very dangerous because the iodine goes to the thyroid glands of young children, causing thyroid cancer. And the strontium goes to the bones of growing children, causing leukemia.
Certainly people were following that reactor all the time. It did not appear to be a hazard to the public or to our employees. And in retrospect, it wasn't a hazard to our employees or public. And we put the plant back on the line.
In 1989, the Daily News reported on a secret study conducted by the Department of Energy revealing widespread chemical and radioactive contamination at the site, which had contaminated the mountain.
Boeing has been ordered by the state to clean up the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, and the company says they have made tremendous progress, but Consumer Watchdog claims instead they've used lobbyists to sidestep the project. Activist Dan Hirsch.
Boeing